Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today, I'm talking about the Chemical Brothers soundtrack to the film Hanna. I realize it's not Hanna, it's Hanna. I've seen the movie now. This review is one I've half been dreading, because reviewing film soundtracks is always such a weird prospect, and this one in particular I've not been sure about since I returned to it infrequently. But on top of that, it's also weird because this is currently the most popular release from the Chemicals on iTunes, and is apparently a lot of people's introduction to these guys. I personally can't imagine starting here of all places. But to be honest, I also hadn't really pinned down my own feelings on this soundtrack either. I mean, in my Born in the Echoes review, I mentioned that this was one of those soundtracks that could allow me to forget it was a soundtrack at all. And in retrospect, this is absolutely false. This is definitely a soundtrack, and not one in which you can easily ignore its identity as such. For the record, that's not necessarily a bad thing either. I mean, I've always thought making film soundtracks can help artists discover a new side to their style that they wouldn't explore otherwise, and this is absolutely a good example of such. I think what's closer to what I meant is that this is also a soundtrack that is very easily identifiable as the Chemical Brothers. It constantly carries their style and sound throughout, even though they'd never done any film work before this, I don't think. Like, the sound palette utilized here is exactly the same as on Further, but of course presented in a very different way. Now, before I talk about the soundtrack album, I will have to first discuss the movie itself and how the soundtrack works in context. This will probably be pretty short, as quite frankly, when I watched the movie, the soundtrack was one of the last things on my mind. I have no idea how to feel about this movie. I'm not sure if I like it or not. I went in thinking that it was gonna be this dumb action flick about a child super soldier, and it was, kind of that? But it's also kind of unlike any other action movie I've ever seen. One that probably thought it was a lot smarter than it actually was. It's super heavily stylized, like much more so than even Pusher. The acting is pretty good, albeit needed some warming up to. But the editing is kind of out of whack in some areas for no good reason. There's a crap ton of on-the-nose symbolism, and the story brings in these weird fairy tale elements near the end that seem to come from out of nowhere. It was such a surreal experience. Probably worth one watch, but I don't know about any more than that. I mean, I personally am not interested in watching it a second time. But the actual soundtrack? Yeah, worked great. It did confuse me since the soundtrack album totally presents everything out of order. Like, Container Park is in the middle of the movie. Like, Special Ops at the beginning, Interrogation, Lonesome Subway, and Grimm's House, they're all on the same track on the soundtrack, but they're all from completely different parts of the movie. And, also, I think Escape Wavefold and Escape 700 are in the exact same scene. And all that bullshit gave me a headache. But, in the context of the movie, it accomplished exactly what it was supposed to. It did in fact end up with me liking the whole thing out of context a lot more, which is exactly what these soundtracks are supposed to do. Like, the main track that I turned around on after seeing the movie has to be The Devil Is in the Details. Before seeing the movie, I thought this track was really out of place. Like, what the hell is this insulting, Chinese-sounding thing doing in an action movie soundtrack? But as it turns out, this track is basically the single most revisited motif in the movie. There's this assassin character who is constantly whistling this tune basically every time you see him. I'm convinced once you see this movie, you will never forget that little theme song ever again. I'm still not sure why it sounds Chinese, since the character looks more like Scandinavian or something. Maybe they were trying to make it sound like a creepy carnival theme or something, and they made it kind of resemble that cliched Chinese riff on accident? I have no idea. As for other tracks on here, there's not precisely a ton to say. But they're all basically shorter and more simplistic takes on the usual Chemical Brothers sound. Generally, it's of course the stuff from action scenes where they get to utilize their sound to the best results. Stuff like Escape 700 and Escape Wavefolds, which have a typically abrasive and intense sound. And of course Container Park, which is the most popular track on here, and unsurprisingly one of the catchiest as well. Plays during 2 different big action scenes in the movie, and was one of the moments where I was like, yeah, this is gonna be one of those tracks that I'm gonna need to remember. Same with their superior remix of The Devil Is in the Details, which unfortunately doesn't show up until the credits. The Devil Is in the Beats. Though with that one I felt like I was going to remember it anyway. Another track I think might actually be kind of underrated in this lineup is Car Chase parentheses ARP Worship. This is a track that I think could work fine completely out of context as a regular Chemical Brothers track. It's a lot of abrasive fun along similar lines of their various electronic battle weapon tracks like Saturate and Don't Stop the Rock. And also some of the stuff from Born the Echoes. Even Container Park, I think, works better as a film cue than as its own track. Like, I think it was singled out more for its catchiness than its effectiveness as a standalone track. Car Chase ARP Worship is not super catchy itself, but it is a track that could probably use more love. I did very much enjoy this one. And of course, got to talk about Hanna's theme, presented both as a regular film cue in the beginning, of the soundtrack, it shows up in the middle of the movie. And the more straightforward Where Do I Begin style single at the end, I think it works more effectively in the latter context, because it's, you know, an actual song and stuff. I don't know if I'd rank it up with their actual mainline singles, but it closes out the movie and soundtrack album out on a strong note. But going back into the soundtrack for the first time in years, I kind of already expected to like all those tracks. There were actually some of the softer cues that ended up surprising me more, like the Sandman, which was like a more overtly creepy take on the Devil in the Details motif played mostly on glockenspiels. That was a big standout for me. And also especially Marissa Flashback. Didn't expect to be into this one since I've never been huge on like lo-fi tearing audio, especially in an ambient context. But this one provides some more haunting and emotional atmosphere that works a lot more effectively than I'd have thought. I guess Tim Hecker effect or something. Of course, there are cues that don't stand out though, like The Forest. Literally the only cue from the first 20 minutes of this movie, and is barely anything outside of like creepy sound effects. Yeah, I forgot to mention, this movie has like no music at all for the first 20 minutes or so. Which I thought was kind of weird, but I think the director was trying to be symbolistic with that because the character Hanna had no music in her life until leaving the forest. So, yeah. But there are other cues here which are basically sound effects like the Chalice tracks. I have no idea where in the movie those are. I don't think there was any way I could have noticed. They're barely even music. There are even some up-tempo tracks that don't leave as strong an impression on me. Like Bonhoeffer Rumble, Hanna vs. Marissa, Special Ops. I mean, they're all very effective in context, but they're just kind of little abrasive moments that are topped by better tracks on this soundtrack album. Oh, and there are 2 tracks on this album, Sun Collapse and Isolated Howl, which don't really even justify existence as their own tracks and are really just intros to Special Ops and Container Park respectively. Sun Collapse in particular, I have to question why that is its own track. Like, it's only 11 seconds for crying out loud. But yeah, I think that's about it as far as individual tracks go. So overall in the entire soundtrack album, on one hand, one big problem I kind of have with it that I already haven't mentioned is that the Hanna soundtrack hasn't held up as well as I'd expected to repeat listens. Maybe because I was kinda lukewarm on the movie itself, but I have definitely been getting sick of this soundtrack over the past couple of days. I mean, after like 4 or 5 listens, I'm just like, I don't really want to listen to this anymore. To be fair, I think Push the Button is really the only album of theirs that I didn't get even remotely sick of by the time I reviewed it. I mean, I can't even listen to Further or Surrender over and over a lot, and I still love both of those albums, but whatever. Fact of the matter is, I don't think there's a single track on this soundtrack album that I would consider among The Chemicals' best work. At least, completely by itself. Not Container Park, not The Devil Is in the Beats, not even Car Chase Art Worship or the vocal version of Hanna's theme. All really good tracks for sure, but you're not going to see any of them on my upcoming top 10 list, just saying. I think this soundtrack works best when you just listen to it completely out of context from front to back. I mean, I think the album is specifically set up to be like that. I mean, they kind of, sort of, try to do a continuous mix thing with the tracks to make some of them less, conspicuous, I guess? I don't know. So even though personal enjoyment-wise, this soundtrack has not exactly been growing on me, I'm still gonna have to recommend it as a whole, because it's everything that I like in film soundtracks from artists I like. Like, making a film soundtrack did in fact allow the Chemicals to explore a new side of their sound and be more experimental, though of course not to the point of not sounding like themselves. I'm not sure how much I'd recommend it if it weren't a soundtrack. To be fair, I don't think I don't think this would have made sense not as a soundtrack. But this is one of the best examples of a film soundtrack by an electronic band or artist I like. Hits that perfect balance of sounding like a soundtrack, but also sounding like the Chemical Brothers, and provides more than a few new catchy melodies to add to their repertoire. I personally wouldn't recommend starting here if you're not already familiar with the Chemicals, but then again, apparently a lot of people did in fact start here and went on to become big Chemicals fans, so what do I know? All I know is that this is a wonderfully unique soundtrack album with a lot to like about it, and it's definitely worth your time if you're either a Chemicals fan or a film soundtrack fan, so I guess I'm overall feeling a 7.7 out of 10. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave comments in the comment thing down there. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.